We're going to bring in Anthony Leonardi. He's a breaking news reporter from the Washington Examiner. Anthony, when we look at the state of unrest that did take place last night, in my eyes, it was a little bit more peaceful than the prior nights before, but that's not to say it was completely peaceful. Am I right to say that? Is that the situation that we were seeing on Tuesday night?
Yeah, what you're seeing in Washington, D.C. is definitely a bit more peaceful than it was certainly on Monday, where over 300 arrests were conducted, and there were helicopters as launched by the National Guard. And they're currently investigating to see why that was taken, why that action was taken. As of the most recent protests in Washington, D.C., they have been, for the large part, peaceful. That's not to say that is reflective of the protests that have devolved into violence in other cities, such as New York City. We've seen New York Governor Andrew Cuomo condemn the actions and the handling of the criminal activity that took place in Bill de Blasio's area. So there are certainly a lot of cities that are still being affected by criminal activity. But in Washington, D.C., right outside the White House, there is a large number of protesters that are gathering, and it has become more peaceful, ostensibly.
And when we talk about this too, sometimes the rioting and the looting is overshadowing the bigger issue of what's going on, why these protesters are turning out to begin with. And a big part of that was the lack of charges being brought against 3 other officers, as well as the primary officer who was involved in that killing. Now we see that charges are being brought. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison elevated, I should say, the 3rd-degree murder charge to a 2nd-degree murder charge, and then also followed through with charges against those 3 other officers for aiding and abetting that effort. What does this mean for the overall movement? Should we see a decrease in protests, do you think, or do you not think that this will change much?
Well, with that intensified charge, it means that there's actually more to prove in court, because 3rd degree obviously implies that there doesn't have to be an intent when there is a killing. 2nd degree, that case actually changes. And so what you're going to see is a more difficult case put upon the lawyers that are representing. That does mean that there could be a changed message in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, and specifically those who are protesting the death of George Floyd. It may mean an altered approach in terms of the legal strategy going forward for the attorney of Floyd's family, and it will dictate how the state of Minnesota is going to act in the future.
Yeah, and because it's a more complicated thing to prove, there's more of an intent thing behind it. And a lot of people are fearful that maybe that'll be harder to prove in a court of law. And for those extra 15 years, maybe a jury won't necessarily side with that intent. It's something that we do see in a lot of police shooting cases where sometimes the police officer is overcharged and it seems right in the media. But when you sit down and talk to a jury in a very isolated setting, when they get those jury instructions, it's a lot more complicated to prove. So I'm a little bit worried on that front, if we're going to be honest. But when we peg this out into the bigger picture, too, the whole reason that these people are marching on the streets is calling for police reforms. I really haven't heard too many specifics when it comes to that. But is there any maybe movement on that front where there may be some changes coming to our police system?
Not drastic change that you've seen the right and the left come to a compromise on. You have seen discussions from people on the right talk about whether or not police should be allowed to use certain chokeholds when it comes to enforcement or detaining or arresting people that they suspect. So there are micro conversations occurring on that front, and you may possibly see change there. But so far, the message that we've seen from the White House is that the president has condemned this as something that is an unjust death that occurred in Minneapolis. And so what you see right now is just more micro conversations, and it seems that the broad conversation about reform in law enforcement is still forthcoming. But we see that the Minnesota governor has taken a part to have a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department to see if their practices and conduct over the last 10 years have been targeted and have had racial prejudice towards Black residents in their state.
It's very interesting. And do you think that we'll see more type of demonstrations tonight moving forward?
Oh, most definitely. The hope is that right now, with the mobilization of the National Guard, we've seen this occur in California and in other areas, that the law enforcement presence there will be able to contain criminal activity, and that protests will be able to resume normally and peacefully. But we can expect more protests to occur, especially given these upped or escalated charges.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving parts. I mean, just today we have charges, the demonstrations going on. We hear a federal response, state response. I mean, it's a lot of moving parts, and I really appreciate you coming on tonight, breaking down this complicated situation at a very complicated time. Thank you, Anthony.